Okay, this is a video over the cranial bones of the skull, the bones and markings. These will be the ones that you'll have to identify on your lab practical. I'm using the updated list that I gave you. I have both take this one off, both a just plain skeleton and a colored skeleton, because when you take your lab practical, it's going to be pictures from the plain skeleton, but I want you to see it on the colored skeleton. So how you identify one bone from another is you look at the sutures, and you probably can't see the sutures so well. So the sutures are like these lines right here. Okay, so they separate the bones, and that's one of the first things on the list is the suture. So here's this cranial suture, which you see on this one right here. Okay, so the cranial suture is here and here. It separates the frontal bone from the parietal bone. And then you have the sagittal suture down the back. The sagittal suture separates the two parietal bones. You have the lambdoid suture, which is back here. It separates the occipital from the parietal. So there's the lambdoid. And then you have the squamous suture right here on either side that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bones. Okay, so close up in a picture, hopefully if I pull this up, you should be able to see those suture lines. So this, as we said before, is the frontal bone right here. So it's the one that's in blue. And the bone marking that you need to know for this is the infraorbital foramen. And those are two little holes that are right above on the eyebrow ridge. Or not the the supraorbital foramen. These are the super above orbital for the eye orbit foramen because they're holes. So you can see the tiny little hole right here. And if we spin it around, you can see the tiny little hole right here. Okay, next on the list are the parietal bones. These are the bones in green right here. There's a pair of them, one on either side. No markings on that. Next is the temporal bone, and it's this orange bone. Okay, so think of your ear for the temporal bone. And here it is right here. It has this squamous suture. And notice it's part of this cheekbone too. So the first thing on the temporal bone you have to know is the mandibular fossa. And a fossa is an indentation. And it occurs right here where the mandible and the temporal bone meet. It's hard to see on that one, so I'm going to show you this on here. So it's this indentation right here where your mandible fits in. And so this forms the temporomandibular joint, which you should be able to identify. So this right here is the temporomandibular joint between the temporal bone and the mandible. Okay, next on the temporal bone is the zygomatic process, and so it's this orange part, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. On the white bone, on the plain bone, you should be able to see there's a suture right here, and that separates the zygomatic process of the temporal bone from the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So this suture is what separates them. So that will be important. You have to know which side of the suture you're trying to identify. Okay, next is the styloid process. So if you turn the skulls over, you can see, hopefully right here, a little thing that sticks up, and over here, styloid process. So these are sites of muscle attachment. And then next is the mastoid process. So it's this big, massive one. You can feel that behind your ear. It's kind of pointy behind your ear. So mastoid process and then styloid process right here. On this one, you have the mastoid process right here, the massive mastoid, and then the styloid process right in here. Okay, next on the list is the external auditory meatus. So this is the opening to your ear. And so that's right here in front of the mastoid process. Okay. Next is the carotid and the jugular foramen. So foramen are holes. So They are in the temporal bone, so the orange part. And then if we look at this big hole here, right here, there's an indentation on either side. These are the carotid foramen. So hopefully you can see the carotid foramen here and the carotid foramen here. And then it's hard to see from this angle, but there's a hole right here that the pencil's going through. That's the jugular foramen. So the jugular vein goes through the jugular foramen, and the carotid artery goes through the carotid foramen. So on this skull, I'm actually going to show you this skull right here where the mandible is missing. Okay. So these are up high, so carotid foramen right here and right here. So they're next to the styloid process. Okay, carotid foramen and then jugular foramen. So do you see that hole right there and the hole right there? Okay, carotid and jugular. Okay. And you can see the jugular foramen from the inside. You cannot see the carotid foramen from the inside. So if you look at this, I'm going to put my pencil in the jugular foramen, and you flip it over, and you can see see the pencil right here. It's right here. Okay, so jugular foramen. Okay, that was everything on the temporal bone. So then the occipital bone, of course, is this bone in the back. Okay. And you have the foramen magnum, which is this big opening right here. Magnum meaning large, so actually large hole is what foramen magnum means. And this is where the end of your brainstem or medulla oblongata comes out, and then your spinal cord through here, the foramen magnum. And then on either side of it is this smooth little surface right here called a condyle. So these are the occipital condyles, and they sit on top of your first vertebrae right here like this. So there are smooth bumps on either side. And then the last thing is the external occipital protuberance, which is this bump right here. You can feel it on the back of your head. There's kind of a ridge, and it's usually bigger in males than females. And it's going to be for muscle attachment. So here is the suture, lambdoidal suture, and underneath this is the occipital bone. Here's the foramen magnum. Here are the occipital condyles on either side of it. And here's the external occipital protuberance. Okay. And then next, we're going to the sphenoid bone. So if you look at the PowerPoint or the video, you'll see the sphenoid is an unusual shaped bone. It's an irregular bone. The two places where you have to identify it are right here, right behind the eye, okay? And on this bone, you can see it. And again, this is one where you have to look for sutures. So here it is. Here's the squamous suture. Here's a sphenoid bone right here. Okay. And then you can also see it on the inside of the eye socket. So if you grabbed your eye on either side, okay, the bone of your eye at either side of your cheekbone, that would be the sphenoid bone. So on here, again, you're grabbing it, that's sphenoid, and back here sphenoid. But the place where you see the biggest part of it is if I open this up and I look at it here. So I'm going to turn it around. Here's the front of the face. So I'm looking at the top. Here's the front of the face. Here's the back of the head. And the sphenoid bone is this one in red. So it's often called, it has a butterfly shape to it. It's called a keystone bone because so many other bones attach to. Okay. So the markings on this that you have to identify. First is this sella turcica. The pituitary gland sits in here. It's like a little saddle. Next is the optic foramen, and they are these holes on either side right here and here. And that's where your optic nerve comes in. So if you look in the eye, hopefully you can see that pencil in there. So that's the optic foramen. Okay, next is the superior occipital, superior orbital fissure. And so it's this little slit right here, but the easiest place to see it is from the front. So here, that's your optic foramen, and then there's a little slit right next to it, which is probably hard to see, but a fissure is a slit. That's a superior orbital fissure. And then down here, you can see this slit right here. This is the inferior orbital fissure. Okay, so optic foramen, superior fissure, inferior fissure. And then two holes or openings. So if we go back to here, we already had the optic foramen here. So there's actually three, but you just have to learn two of them. So you have these two big holes. So this big one that's closest to the sella turcica is the foramen lacerum. So think sella has L, foramen lacerum is close to it, right there. And then next to it is the foramen ovule because it has an oval shape. So foramen lacerum and foramen ovule. From this side, you can also see them from this side. So here is the foramen lacerum. These are the ones that are closest in. It's the bigger one. And then the foramen ovules are right here. So let's look at those on this skull. So the sphenoid bone, remember if you grab the eye, so way in here, because this is part of the zygomatic bone, so in here and out here, grab the eye. Okay, then if I flip it around, it's this butterfly part. Here's our sella turcica, our saddle. Here's the optic foramen right here. Look through the front. You have your optic foramen, your superior fissure, your inferior orbital fissure. And then you have your foramen lacerum and foramen ovule right here. So ovule, lacerum, lacerum, ovule. Flip it over. Okay, the big holes right here, foramen, lacerum, and then outside the foramen ovule. That leaves us with the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone is kind of an unusual looking one. It's another irregular bone. It would be well worth your time to look at the PowerPoints, the video or the PowerPoint I put up. So the ethmoid bone makes up the top part of your nose and your nasal septum. The septum is the part that separates your left nostril from your right nostril. So this is ethmoid bone. You can also see ethmoid bone right here. So you have nasal, you have frontal. This is called the lacrimal, and then you have ethmoid bone. So it's here and here. And then it also sticks up into the base of your cranium. So this is ethmoid bone. And then these are the two markings on the ethmoid bone. There's a part that sticks up. That's called the crystal galli. And that's where the meninges that cover the brain attach. And then on either side of the crystal galli, you have the cribriform plate, and it has a whole bunch of olfactory foramen in there. And those are the holes for your nerves to your brain, your olfactory bulbs to go through. So remember, the smell odors are coming in here. The nerves are coming through here up to your brain. Okay, so on this bone, my ethmoid, the top part of my nose, this inner part of my eye. So remember, I have nasal, maxilla, lacrimal, and then I have ethmoid. And then the most common one is right in here. And hopefully you can see this little part that sticks up is the cribriform plate, and then this is the crystal galli, right? Wrong way. This is the cribriform plate. The flat one's the plate with a olfactory foramen, and the part that sticks up is the crystal galli. And these are all the bones of the cranium that protect your brain.